All right. So right now we got this 800 by 480 section that is kind of this diamond plated metal. Looks like a walkway or something that you could use. And last class we went and we added this rust texture to it that we just stole off the internet, which makes it look kind of cool. But we can't be stealing stuff off the internet. So we got to kind of make it ourselves. It won't be this cool, but it will be good enough, I think. So we're going to look at a couple of new techniques, a couple of new tools as well, just in Photoshop, because again, everything we do, I want to add in a new feature. I don't want to use the same tools over and over again. Part of the purpose of the class is to teach you all the tools in Photoshop. The other part of the purpose of the class is to teach you how to create these textures in UV maps. With any hope, you'll be able to have an idea of a texture and use the tools that we've talked about to make the texture yourself. We'll see if that works. So we're going to do a file new. And again, we're going to do, I think I said it was 800 by 480. We're going to do another 800 by 480 and we're going to create it. Now, when we get through this, it will be the same size as our metal texture here. So we'll be able to blend it over really well. So now we got to come up with rust colors.
Brown.
Orangish red, brown. So if I open this up, you see I can drag this slider over here to change the colors. By default, what I'm looking at right now is the hue. But if you wanted to do the saturation, you could find kind of more saturated or less saturated colors, brightness the same way. So I'm going to click on hue and I'm going to try to find a reddish brown or orange reddish. Yes, sir.
800 by 450, right?
800 by 480. So if I drag it all the way to the bottom, I'm only working with red hues. If I drag it all the way up to here, I'm only working with yellowish. But if I come in the middle, I've got this red-orange effect, sort of. You can pick whatever you think is red-orange. This is yellow. I don't know, or green. I don't know how green gets into it. But this feels like kind of red-orange to me. But if you recall, colors aren't my specialty. So
brown and yellow right now. You're showing me.
yeah, brown, yellow, orange, red, those kinds of colors. So I think what I'm going to do, I want one dark color and one kind of brighter color. So I'm going to go with these two colors here. So this one is my foreground, and then this one here is my background. This one here is my background. It's not an exact science. If you have two colors that you think look rusty, then you can work with those. So what we talked about before was the idea that sometimes we just have to get paint on the canvas in order to be able to work with it. You could use the gradient, just slap it in, but there's some really easy fill methods that give you some detail to work with. And one of them is filter, render, clouds. And every time you do this, it's going to give you a little bit of a different feature, right? It's going to look a little bit different every time. This is something that the render does, is it uses this kind of random effect to give you this kind of color variation. So it doesn't matter which one you pick, right? I like to try and pick one with a lot of color variation. So like really dark darks and really light lights. Go ahead.
You told me how you got everything right.
Absolutely. So we'll go up to filter and then render, and then clouds. Now, if you click difference clouds, that is a very different effect. It does the same thing, but it's using the negative values of your color. Just going to be a lot darker, and it's not as easy to work with. So just make sure you do filter, render, and clouds. You can try some of the other ones if you just wanted to see kind of the effect that they have. Depending on what you need, the way you get paint onto the canvas to begin with will change. For this rust, we're using filter, render, clouds. Because of the nature that this is randomized, your clouds will never look exactly the same as my clouds, which is good because that helps when you're creating a texture to have some sort of that uniqueness. Next thing we want to do is go to filter, sharpen, and unsharp mask. It brings up this little menu here, and this is a weird tool. When everything is 0, you see it looks kind of blurry. The mask is called an unsharp mask, but as you increase these features, it starts to create more of a sharpness in your image. If you turn them all the way down, then you lose a lot of sharpness, but you can turn them up and you see it starts to isolate the colors more. So when they're all really down, you have a really smooth transition between your dark browns and your light browns or reds, whatever they are. As you turn it up, it starts to give you a much sharper transition between those. You can turn the threshold all the way up and you kind of get that blurriness back. But you want to leave the threshold down and just play with the amount and the radius until you get kind of an effect that you're comfortable with. You know, you don't want to make it too extreme, but what I want to do with this is create a strong contrast between my light colors and my dark colors. So mine is set to 162 and 86.3 and 4. Those numbers are completely arbitrary because your clouds, remember, were different than mine to start off with. Your colors may have been different than mine to start off with. You're just looking to create a really sharp contrast between your colors. We're going to keep using this filter effect. We're going to go into the filter gallery now. So filter and then filter gallery. Don't spend a whole lot of time getting that filter unsharpness effect. Just pick something and run with it for now. But we're going to go to the filter gallery next. Now the filter gallery is full of a ton of different preset filters. You're going to go to filter and then filter gallery, which is about a third of the way down. And that brings up this tool called the filter gallery. And you can click on them and you see that they change a lot of different effects on what you're working with. But the interesting thing about this is that every effect, so let's use rough pastels. Every effect you have has a bunch of different sliders associated with it, and you can customize the effect to be exactly like you want it to be. Now, a lot of this just means that you're actually just kind of playing with the tools until you get the visual that you want. I will say it is relatively impossible to store all of these different filters in your brain along with all of their different settings. But when you need some variety in your design, coming to the filter gallery gives you the opportunity to find some tool that's going to give you that variety. So I'm going to go and pick the smudge stick for what I'm trying to do here. And again, I'm really just trying to create that contrast between my dark spots and my light spots. Another thing that's cool that you can do in the filter gallery that you need to know, not something we're going to do right now, but the filter gallery also has layers, just like the layers in Photoshop. But the difference is, right now I've applied the smudge stick. If I apply a new layer, it's by default going to apply the smudge stick again. So it's just doing the same thing. But if I change it to, I don't know, let's go back to, what was I using before? The rough pastels. So go back to the rough pastels, and I can turn my stroke length down. I don't want it to be that hard. Turn my stroke detail down. And the rough pastels has a texture associated with it. You could do a brick texture, which doesn't make any sense for this. Sandstone usually gives you just almost like a noise effect. And you can make it as strong or as weak as you want. And you can change the direction of the light. All this is doing is just using the tools to try to get you some variety in your design. If I drag my rough pastels above the smudge stick, you'll notice it changes ever so slightly because it's applied the pastels before it's applied the smudge. Or you can apply the smudge before you apply the pastels. You can have any number of layers over here and what they do and how they work together. And one thing that I like about this, you can come in, anyone can come in and add a effect, right? But once you get into the weeds as far as merging the effects, blending the effects, and really getting the visual that you want specifically, that's when you start creating something that the random 12-year-old couldn't come in and create. And that's what you want. You want a little bit more control and uniqueness, and you want it to look like something that you have done. So once you get it looking smudged a little bit, you've got that good contrast and some sort of little pattern on it, go ahead and say okay, and then this is what we have right now. But remember, we're going to apply this to overlay this effect here. So we need it to be a little bit more grainy. What? You're throwing a ball. Got it. We wanted to be a little bit more subdued, I guess. I've created the heavy contrast, right? But I want it to be just a little bit more, I think grainy is the right word because we're going for rust. So we're just going to do filter and noise and add noise. We've done this before. We're going to use a Gaussian noise and monochromatic. You turn it way up, obviously it gets rid of everything. It's not what we like. But bring it down. The more you turn it up, the more grainy it gets. There's a number in here for everybody that is going to be grainy enough, but you still keep your detail. I think for me, I'm going to be around 7, probably 7%. So that gives me a little bit of a grain effect, makes it look rougher. Certainly rougher than it did. And then the last thing that we're going to do is learn another new tool. It's called the dodge tool. If you need me to take a break and slow down, say so. So there's a dodge tool and a burn tool. And these tools are basically the same tool. They just work in opposite of one another. So the burn tool, what do you think happens when you burn something? It's going to get darker. And if you know that the dodge tool is the opposite of that, what happens when you use the dodge tool? It brightens it up. Whichever tool you have selected, I'm going to have the burn tool selected. If I hold down Alt, it uses the other tool. So I can burn something, and if I hold down Alt, I'm dodging something, even though I'm still using the same tool. So what I want to do here is I want to kind of try and pick in my head a direction that the light is coming from. Because with rust, it's kind of flaking off. That's the shape, that's the idea that we're trying to represent, right? So these lighter spots are going to be underneath. The darker spots are going to be kind of on the top. So what I want to do is, using my burn tool, I'm going to pick a pretty small brush, and I want to turn my exposure up here, probably up to about 80%. So what exposure does is it's just how dark is it making it. So if I were to use an 18%, it's noticeable, but not as much. And if I were to use a 100%, then it's almost like I'm painting on a darker color. I want it to be pretty strong. So I'm going to set it to about 80%. And then I want to come around the edges where I can and just create some spots around some of the corners and edges that look like maybe where the shadow would be hitting underneath. So I'm darkening up kind of the lighter sections where I can. And then I'm going to use my dodge tool and lighten up the sections that are directly above those dark sections that I just did. And if you spend a lot of time, then you could get a lot of effects like this, where it looks like there's some shading, some shadow underneath, and then the light is hitting on the top. And this representation, my light is coming from the right side. But it's going to take a lot of time to go through and kind of represent this everywhere. But I guess that's kind of part of what we're doing, right? And just using the darkness to represent a shadow and the dodge tool to represent a highlight. Again, it's a little bit arbitrary. And I don't think, my problem is I want my darkness to be really dark, but I want my highlights not to be that dark. So I'm going to be changing my exposure. Whenever I'm using the dodge tool, my exposure is going to be about 20%. And whenever I'm using the burn tool, my exposure is going to be about 80%. And we could spend a ton of time on that, but I'm not going to. I'm going to cheat just a little bit. With my burn tool selected, I'm going to come up to my brush pattern. And I'm going to come down to special effects brushes. And I'm going to choose a Kyle's spatter brush.
Which one?
It doesn't matter. I'm picking the one on the top. So I have my brush tool here. And as I drop that down, if I scroll all the way down towards the bottom, I'll eventually see special effects brushes.
Okay.
If I drop down the special effects brushes, I'll get Kyle's spatter brushes. Now, I don't know what Kyle did to be so special, but Kyle's got spatter brushes. Yeah, mine's big. I'm going to put it on a new layer, actually. And then just kind of click some of the spatter around. And once I get some spatters on there, I'm going to go to filter and I want to blur these with a motion blur. And again, this is all a little bit subjective, however you want to do it. But I'm going to blur mine probably at about 40 degrees and at a distance of maybe, I don't know, 8 or 9 pixels. And that, what's that? Filter, blur, and motion blur. And that just gives me a little bit more detail. Yep.
So when you pull it up, you go and get a little spatters up, how do you shrink them back down to where they're fit in the screen?
What do you mean?
Like, see, mine's like big, like how do
You can just turn the size down if you need to.
okay.
My size is about 600 now. Once you get all the splatters in, you get them blurred like you want. Then I want you to check the layer that you put them on. So we put them on a new layer. And then that layer, if you look at all the different options, there's a darken option, a multiply option, color burn. And you see these all have kind of a different effect on your overall object or overall print. I'm going to use hard light. And again, this is, again, subjective, right? It's whatever you think looks best for your particular brand of crazy. But I'm going to use hard light, and that just, it gives a little bit more enhancing to the splatter that I put on it to make it a little bit darker. But it blends better with the kind of grainy pattern underneath. I'm going to double click on the layer. And then I have a blending mode, and I'm going to take it down to hard light. Say okay. There's also a quick key for hard light right here above my layer menu. And I can just use that, which is what I use to begin with. Now, once you have this laid out and you feel pretty good about it, I want you to right click and flatten the image. And then we're going to do something else we haven't done before. I know that my metal texture for me is called Untitled 3 because I never saved it. I just left it open on my computer and walked away. That's bad practice, but that's what I did. Now I have Untitled 5, which is my rust texture. I'm going to right click on my background or on my layer over here that has my rust texture on it. And I'm going to duplicate layer. And when I duplicate layer, it gives me a couple of options. It's going to tell me what do I want to name my layer. And I'm going to name it rust. And then it's going to ask me for the destination. By default, the destination is the same file that I'm currently working on. But I can change this to any other file. So I'm going to change it to Untitled 3 because that's where my metal texture is. And when I hit OK, it puts this layer over on the file that I told it I was working on. How to what? Yeah, give me 1 second and I'll do that again. Once you have it duplicated, you'll do the same thing that we did with the rust that we stole. We are going to use an overlay or a soft light, whichever one you think looks best for you. Maybe you like the color burn, which is scary, or the multiply, which is really dark, or the dark, which is less dark than multiply. I'm going to use the overlay because that lets a lot of my rust colors that I chose kind of shine through. But it is really strong, so I'm going to come in and turn my opacity down to maybe 80% to give it a little bit less of an effect. And that is a really simple rust texture that we have made and applied. Now you'll see, you may not think it looks as good as the other rust texture, and it probably doesn't, but it's a step in the right direction.
I got a lot of it in the apartment. So like,
Sure. Let me fix the splatter blur first. Okay. So for Aiden, to get the blur back, you're going to go to Filter, Blur, and Motion Blur. And that just gives you, it's like you just moved it really quickly and left some of the information behind. Juan, what was your question?
Like, how do you like combine the two?
The two layers?
Like, I got it on one screen with the layers, the diamonds. Just like, how do I combine them and put them together?
Okay, give me 1 second. All right, so just going quickly to hit the tools. The first thing we did was choose our colors. We went to Filter, Render, Clouds, and that kind of gave us our base that we were working with. I tried to find one that had a high contrast between the two colors. So that was the first thing I did, but a lot of what I did on this whole project was to try to create and encourage that contrast. So the next thing I did was I went under the Filter, Sharpen, Unsharp Mask. Whoops. Filter, Sharpen, Unsharp Mask. We talked about how this was a weird tool, but you can adjust it so that it gives you a little bit more of the contrast that I wanted. And then we looked at the filter gallery. And you could have chosen whatever you wanted. I chose a smudge stick and a palette knife. No, smudge stick and a rough pastel. You'll notice the settings that I had are saved in the filter gallery. Now you could change them, whatever, but mine are already saved, so I'm just going to use those again. And that gives me kind of this strong effect. I'm going to add some noise. Again, filter, noise, add noise. We used Gaussian and monochromatic. You can add a bunch of noise and you lose all your detail. I ended up adding about 7. And all this is doing is just making it look a little bit rough because again, it is rust and we want it to be a little bit rough. And then the last thing we did was enhance some of our design by using the smudge tool or using the dodge and burn tool. And we tried to choose where the light was coming from, create some shadows and some highlights. Yeah, and that's pretty much the gist of it pretty quickly. When we were done, we made a new layer. We used a new brush. We used some of Kyle's spatter brushes. Painted those kind of all over our little dude here. Filter, blur, motion blur. Again, my settings are saved, so I'm going to leave them there. And then we use this as I think I used hard light to just get some more detail in there. I merged those layers together, and then I duplicated them and put them on the original document that had my metal on it. On the new document, I use that as an overlay. And then I turned my opacity down a little bit because I didn't like how dark it was. And that's the whole process of making rust really quickly for a metal texture that you already have. I have 2 options, and they're both fine.